Thank you for joining us at the 2023 edition of Expo Chicago, the International Exposition of Contemporary and Modern Art. On behalf of Northern Trust, we're delighted to welcome you to Exchange by Northern Trust, an interactive conversation around the art of collecting, a series of 5 panels on the contemporary art market, institutional and philanthropic engagement, the potential of new technologies, the ethics of collecting, and supporting artists internationally. The following panel, Biennial as Infrastructure, features guest curator of Desert X and chief curator of the Dhaka Art Summit, Diana Campbell, and guest curator of Converge 45, Christian Viveros-Fauné. The conversation will be moderated by Chantal Wong, convener of AFIELD, a network supporting artists and cultural practitioners in long-term social change. Panelists will discuss themes of Diana and Christian's recent and upcoming biennials, in addition to how each biennial works to create ownership with community over time. The panel is presented in partnership with Desert X and Converge 45. Desert X 2023 runs through May 7th, and the Coachella Valley and Converge 45 opens August 24th in venues across Portland, Oregon. Before I turn the microphone over to Chantal, I wanted to mention that today's program is being video recorded for archival and possible future promotional purposes. Audience questions or interactions will not be included in future promotional materials. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on the Saturday afternoon at 3 p.m. when there's so many things going on. I know that there's also another exciting panel on architecture, the Architecture Biennial, which we also wish that we could hear. But I'm going to quickly introduce the panelists. I know that Kate already generously did that, but I'll give a little bit more of a thorough introduction. But the premise of today's conversation is really, the title is Biennial as Infrastructure, but in fact, I think we're taking a deeper dive looking at maybe the evolution of biennials. I know this is a 40-minute conversation, so we can't cover everything, but touch on sort of the evolution of biennials because at some level they've played a role in bringing in international audiences and international communities and presenting what's most exciting about contemporary art at that moment, at that present moment. But I think increasingly this last year we've seen Istanbul Biennial or Documenta really also taking a socially conscious turn to look at what is the role of biennials. Documenta really, I think, under the I don't want to say leadership, but under the collective group leadership of Rangrupa and many collectives, was trying to maybe deconstruct the role of biennials, not looking at singular artists, but how can biennials present collective energy and collective creative processes, for instance. And so there's almost like a new, I don't want to say responsibility, but maybe a new conversation that biennials are engaging in now to really look at their role within a larger community question and collective question of their role within society. I will first do a very quick bio. Sorry, I'm using my phone. So first, Christian Viveros-Fauné is the artistic director for the next edition of Converge 45, a citywide biennial in Portland that opens on the 24th of August, 2023. That's pretty soon. This edition is titled Social Forms, Art as Global Citizenship. Christian is a writer and curator living and working in Brooklyn. He serves as still curator at large at the University of South Florida Contemporary Art Museum and is a regular contributor to Art Newspaper and The Village Voice. In 2018, Christian wrote published a book, A Short History of Political Art, that presents 50 artworks that gives voice to calls to political action that can be found in modern art. So I think that's like a very firm anchor into this conversation, the political role of art. And Diana Campbell, who's also a very close friend of mine, and we work together on, as Kate mentioned, AFIELD, which is a network highlighting the work of socially engaged practice by artists, has been working in South and Southeast Asia since 2010. She is committed to fostering a transnational art world. Her vision addresses the concerns of underrepresented regions and artists alongside the more established in many different types of platforms and forums. Can I give the line about your family being, yeah, I think that's, okay. Diana's born in LA, but her maternal family is indigenous Chamorro from the island of Guam. And so this part of her history and her heritage plays an important part in creating her vision around her curatorial practice, which seeks to amplify the reach of indigenous voices. Practically, she is the founding artistic director of the Samdani Art Foundation in Bangladesh and is the chief curator of Dhaka Art Summit, where she has been curating with in collaboration with other curators for the last decade. Yeah. Recently, she curated the Dhaka Art Summit, which is a 9-day festival around art in Bangladesh. And Desert X in Coachella Valley, which actually closes on the 7th of May. So if you have a chance, do visit Coachella Valley and then Portland in August. Those are the very extensive and rich bios. And I'm just going to, as a preface, I've stolen 2 lines from the press releases, that art, the social forum, art and global citizenship, experiments that trend toward, it's an experiment that trends towards greater global citizenship and an increasingly participatory culture. It is designed, so art and global citizenship, which is the Converge 45 subtitle, is designed to promote increased citizenship. And then for Dhaka Art Summit, it rejects the traditional biennial format to create a more generative space for art and exchange. So just leaving it at that, I'm gonna let Christian and then Diana talk about your biennials, and then we can take it from there.
Right. So thank you, and thank you for the intro, and thank you guys very much for being here. Social Forums, Art as Global Citizenship is the title for the show that we're doing with Converge 45. It's Converge's sort of second 2.5 iteration. They had a very successful iteration in 2018. COVID interrupted the following one, as it did all our lives. And we sort of picked up about a year and a half ago and began working on this particular project. Social Forums was this book that Diana mentioned that I published back at the end of 2018. Basically, it was 2019. So again, just before lockdown, before everything just went absolutely haywire. And it was sort of in lieu of an exhibition I actually intended to make. I was going to make it somewhere in, I won't mention the institution, but somewhere in New Jersey, where Antonio Saya, who's a buddy, had also done a fairly large exhibition. And so it was sort of the idea of art as a social forum was sort of waiting for me at least to make into some kind of reality. So it first became a book, but then the idea was to essentially sort of the idea had always been to turn it into an exhibition. So when the opportunity came to work with Converge 45, that's clearly sort of where my head went. And the idea of developing an exhibition that is both historical and contemporary, and also citywide in a city like Portland, which has a number of advantages, comparative advantages, also a number of comparative disadvantages, just like every city does. I think one of its significant advantages is actually being a secondary city. I think speaking from the periphery to LA and New York and maybe even Chicago is a very important thing to be doing. There are connections from that periphery that can be made to, I don't know, indigenous art in Chile, for example, or politically committed art coming out of Ireland, for example. So what we sort of tried, or what we're doing, or we're literally sort of in mid-process of doing, is establishing those relationships in an exhibition that has 15 institutional partnerships across the city that run from essentially not-for-profits, right? Smallest not-for-profits to the Portland Art Museum. So we run sort of the gamut. part of what we have to do a show like that is to establish consensus, right, across the city, and take advantage of the kinds of sometimes the relationships that exist and the ones that don't, right? One has the ability to basically sort of underscore certain histories, particularly those that have been invisibilized, right? Portland, like every other city in America, has a particularly difficult issue with race. That's something that some of the work that we're showing is going to talk to. What else to say? Because I know that we don't have an enormous amount of time. But I'd wrap up sort of like my quick gloss by just saying that the nature of these projects, as you well know, and you well know, is that they're massive Megillas. There's a lot of moving parts. I did one of these previously in Ireland in 2011. I always tell people I think I lost about 5 years of my life, but it was actually it was very much worth it. What you get to do in public are things that the general sort of cultural infrastructure in a place like Portland or in a place like Dublin or most cities doesn't do normally, right? The museums don't do normally. They don't function the way that the biennials function. And I do think that's an important aspect of biennials. I'll quit blathering, so I'll let you go, please.
Great. Well, I hardly call that blabbering. So maybe to start, I curated 2 biennials that are also kind of not biennials back to back this year. So the Dhaka Art Summit closed on February 11th and Desert X opened on March 3rd. And that sounds a little bit crazy because Bangladesh and Palm Springs really couldn't be further apart. But the kind of reason for doing this was that they're actually points that are very close to me, and I see parallels that I think could inform each other, if that makes sense. So I think the first time I meaningfully thought about Bangladesh, I was probably like in my late teens or early 20s, and I was privileged enough to meet Mohammed Yunus, who is the Nobel Prize winner who invented microfinance. And he said, like, what's the difference between a Girl Scout, so that's an American reference, and a beggar? One has they're both asking you for money. They're both coming to your door, but one has something to sell and the other doesn't. But what would happen if you lent, beggar is a problematic word. What if you lent that person something to sell? Would that even the playing field? And that to me blew my mind. And it was just this idea. And again, microfinance has problems. This is not to, there's loan sharks. But at the same time, it changed so many people's lives. It has brought so many people out of poverty. And I would call this a form of artistic thinking, right? How can you apply this creativity to change the world? And I really think artists can change the world. And there's an image here, which you've seen of kind of this A-frame house. And this A-frame house is designed by a Bangladeshi architect named Marina Tabassum. And it's now with inflation a $500 structure that can move when people's land breaks away with flooding and climate change. It's built kind of locally by communities. Most of the money goes into the metal joints. But actually, it's imagined from indigenous forms of architecture. And in Palm Springs, the Palm Springs Art Museum has in storage Frey's Luminaire House, which was one of the first flat pack modernist houses, which was meant to solve a housing crisis. But unfortunately, I think aluminum became too expensive and then this was kind of scrapped. But it's also in storage because it's too expensive to build, or to rebuild. So I think it was interesting to look at these 2 versions of architecture, especially in a place like Palm Springs where this kind of modernist architecture is fetishized, but to also show there's other forms of architecture, especially in a place with the housing crisis. So the original plan was to show this structure in Palm Springs, but this structure that costs $500 and changes people's lives in Bangladesh would cost $50,000 to build, and no one could go to the 2nd floor if it were built in Palm Springs. So then this thought biennials infrastructure, that makes absolutely no sense to do. It changes no one's life. It's actually anti-ecological to do that. So luckily, through kind of the executive director of Desert X, Jenny Gills, she's phenomenal. But we decided to commission a film about this project where a filmmaker would go and kind of see what this does in life. And this film is on the internet, which I will now. A journalist asked me, "Why is there a film in a site-specific sculpture exhibition?" I'm like, "Well, digital space is a space now, and this is actually like a portal of imagination to consider everything else you see in the show." But Marina can use this film, her team can use this film. This is an infrastructure that helps the project, but also a tool to think about how do you use what's on the table to address the issues at hand, rather than, have this scarcity mindset that you can't do something because you lack X, Y, Z. And that's something, Bangladesh, when I started working there, was not really a place people associated with contemporary art. And our 6th edition of the Dhaka Art Summit just finished, and we had almost 600,000 people visit in 9 days. So we're technically the highest daily visited contemporary art show, but my audience is both publics that have never seen contemporary art before and international museum directors. I've stayed with each edition, and I think I'm going to do at least two more. But what's great is that it's iterative. So every time we respond to what happened in the last one. And someone once referred to this as like going to a family reunion and watching a child grow up, because you can still see that child from 2 years ago and how maybe she became more mature or how she changed her mind. And in these slides, there was an image of, a very beautiful image of a Rakib Shah painting with some wallpaper behind that. And that for me was really a turning moment. So this was in Dhaka Art Summit 2018. We received a relatively large grant from the Arts Council of England, which enabled 5 institutions in the north of England to collaborate with 5 institutions in South Asia. And because of the kind of power dynamics of that relationship, this project kind of had to look like what you would see in Tate or something like that. So that room, we created Western museum conditions in Bangladesh. We were able, in a country with no art insurance or these kinds of things, to show Rakib Shah's first major presentation in the region. So the way we did that infrastructure, like White Cube lent us their insurance, it's this kind of huge networking of making this happen. But at the end of it, and all these people being so impressed that we recreated Western museum conditions in Bangladesh, I looked at it and I was like, why are we doing this? Art in Bangladesh is not made in those conditions. The cost, actually the cost of couriering some of the Japanese prints that were lent to contextualize this presentation was more expensive than buying the prints themselves. There were also the carbon footprint. But it took doing that to convince, and this was really a hard uphill battle, but to convince the patrons of this project. So I should rewind. The Dhaka Art Summit is supported and founded by a collector couple named Nadia and Rajib Samdani. She's now 40, he's 49. So this was started, over about 10 years ago. So in our 20s and 30s, because they saw that they weren't seeing Bangladeshi artists anywhere in the world, and they wanted to kind of create something where people would come learn about it in its context. But anyway, back to this, to convince them, let's not build walls, let's not bring ACs, can we put that budget into artworks or practices themselves? How do we even just get rid of that idea of what a biennial looks like? And we started getting this confidence that, we don't need to follow that aesthetic, or maybe we don't even need to start researching other biennials so much. What are village theater festivals? It's not that they're not convenings or cultural things in this region or other regions. It's just that they don't look like what it looks like in North America or in Europe. So maybe I've talked a lot. I can pass it on.
Just for, I don't know if everybody in this audience has been to many biennials, but I thought maybe did you want to?
No, I was just going to say, and I don't want to, if you have a question, just a very short observation, that every aspect of what you just talked about is obviously sort of a creation of infrastructure in a place where there wasn't infrastructure. And one of the thoughts I had sort of coming on the seemingly eternal cab ride here was that I did a project with an artist in Goma in Eastern Congo back in 2015, And I was just remembering that was a place without any infrastructure whatsoever. I mean, essentially, the lights were on, electricity was on across town, probably for about 5 hours a day. And then the rest was essentially sort of generators, right? And there was a law school, but they had electricity 5 hours a day. There was no cinema. There was certainly no museum. And so anything that you did, any exhibition itself was infrastructure, right? And I know that Bangladesh has certainly come up in the world socioeconomically in the last couple of decades. But I imagine that what you've just described is a significant amount of sort of infrastructure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's also, so I like to think iteratively like this. So I also look in Desert X, I can see that roads that have been set up from previous editions allow other things to happen, right? So I think you're totally right. I see the Dhaka Art Summit as an infrastructure for artists. Actually, it's kind of great because once you're in Bangladesh, that CV can fall. It can really just be about the work and the encounter with the work. And, but also, where does that budget go? So when you see this image of kind of these, it's like these rotating walls with paintings. So we decided to work with kind of a team of architects and designers, and we decided that the walls would actually be made out of canvas with rented scaffolding. So at the end, you've got an artwork, and the scaffolding goes back to wherever it was rented from. But the painting project was realized by an artist named Shawan Akand and his artist-led initiative called Jota Shilpo, where they worked with cinema banner painters who don't really have work anymore because of globalization. They can just, kind of print Hollywood aesthetic posters. They don't have work anymore. But then he worked with these people as part of his initiative, so he finds new ways to work with crafts that are dying out or in danger because of globalization. And then we worked with Savvy Contemporary in Berlin to make this timeline with researchers about Afro-Asian solidarity movements. And people could, look at these parallel histories. And in the end, this beautiful artwork exists. But that was the infrastructure. If anyone went to Documenta, it was the same cinema banner painters that painted that project in Kassel.
Just taking a few steps back, I do want to anchor within how is this moment kind of evolving and a new opportunity to redefine what the role or what a biennial can do. Maybe some of the potentials, but also some of the gaps in this type of structure, that pops up every 2 years or 3 years. But I think with your situation, you have been an artistic director ongoingly. How does that benefit? But also I know that you're a curator at large at a museum. How does that continuity, what are the pros and cons and the opportunities and risks, if we call it that, of this model? And then how is that shifting now with these types of, with your examples?
Well, I mean, I think, definitional crises, definitional collapse, epistemological crises. Everyone's sort of, that's been sort of the coin of the realm for a bit, right? We're living through a period in which, new definitions are being made, old definitions are being questioned consistently, particularly those that sort of come from the West. There has been a potentializing, I think, of discourse, not only from the Global South, but sort of from potential representatives of the Global South through migration, right? In countries like the U.S. and the U.K. and France, et cetera. So there's a lot of really important discourse happening, and I'm not quite sure where we're going to wind up, but clearly we're moving away from sort of old canonical ideas about what museums are, what art. The functions of art, and by the way, Diana, I'm completely with you. I mean, I do think of art as this beautiful sort of laboratory-like experience where anything is possible in microloans or housing on the south side of Houston, or here experiments that have happened in Chicago as well, and the long history of social engagement. But, and now I'm forgetting exactly where I was going, but so there's a lot up for grabs. There's a lot up for grabs, both with the biennial structure, The continuity that I have in working for the Contemporary Art Museum down in Tampa has been wonderful for me, because otherwise I'm a sort of a guy who is here and then he's there, and so I've been able to establish sort of a continuity of exhibitions that actually hew fairly closely to the kind of show that we're putting on now in Portland, right? Even with some of the same artists, unsurprisingly, certainly with some of the same ideas. I don't get to go quite as far afield as you've been able to, because your context is significantly different from, I think Portland is importantly on the periphery in the U.S., right? And I think in the way that New Orleans felt very much on the periphery when Prospect sort of kicked off, I think there's an opportunity to do things that you can't do in New York and you can't do in LA. One of the things that I always sort of talk about, or one of the examples I sort of like drum out fairly often is the fact that after some 2 decades of development of social engagement as a, obviously a bona fide art form, a thing that exists on the map, a leading edge of development in the visual arts. It didn't show up in an exhibition format in New York until last year. And it showed up in 2 exhibitions. One was Theaster Gates' show at the New Museum, and the other was Rick Lowe showing paintings, not the social engagement he's been long known for at Gagosian, right? And God bless him, because he deserves to make the money. But it's sort of a radical thing that absence is so glaring. There was no major show at any of the museums in New York. There's a way in which the center can be tremendously provincial. And that's something that and I know that but I'm suggesting that even within the U.S., there are ways to essentially sort of attack that provincialism, right? Or to improve it.
I think that's very important. And I think as someone that's American, but that left, America most of my professional career has been outside of the U.S. Desert X was my first major American project, was actually seeing you don't really see emerging American artists showing abroad. And why is that? Because America doesn't really have like an arts council like Australia's Arts Council or Pro Helvetia or these things. So unless the market is supporting you, who's paying for that? And it's really it's something I've been thinking about a lot. And I think also, so Chantal and I are here as part of this network of socially engaged artistic practices, which imagine artists who are starting schools or libraries, and how their artistic practice is also informed by this initiative that they've taken in the world. For me it's very inspiring. And actually, I just recalled this talk that Gayatri Spivak gave at Dhaka Art Summit 2018, and she was saying, like, unless this work, meaning like the work inside the walls of the show, is accompanied by another type of work, meaning the kind of work that artists and activists are doing every day outside, we can never reach this impossible possibility of a socially just world. And I think this type of practice is very important, and you're seeing it a lot in, kind of global South context, but we learned a lot from what we saw in Chicago, and we think that what these initiatives are doing in Chicago could learn a lot from what we're seeing outside. But yeah, there's a lot of bridging that needs to happen. And back to your question, I think, so Desert X, for example, has an artistic director, Neville Wakefield, that stays across all of the editions, and he calls in a guest curator to kind of help him, I guess, see things from another perspective. I, in Bangladesh, the same thing. I call in other curators to kind of contribute to the show, because I also, we have our biases, we have our tastes. I think it's also important to give more people a chance, or to see different points of view. And I also actually prefer co-curating to curating. I love thinking with others. But yeah, I think the ability, it would be really hard for me, I think, to curate a biennial somewhere that I haven't spent significant amounts of time, because I don't think the 2 years is enough time to understand a place, its people, what's relevant. I think you need much more time. So I would say, like, when people ask, like, oh, how long have you been working on this summit? I would actually say from, like, the first day I started working on it. Things that we're doing now would have been absolutely impossible when we started because there wasn't the infrastructure. So, like, I also try with grants, like, buy equipment every time. So, like, at the beginning, you can't rent HG projectors. You cannot, like, basic infrastructure that way is not there. But we have other things. So there's an image here with this kind of auditorium, or this circular structure that's made out of fired and unfired clay pots. It's by a South African architect of Indian diaspora origin named Sumaya Valley. She's very interesting. She did, I think, 2 serpentine pavilions ago. And so basically this pot this was made by potters in Bangladesh. They were on site, building these for about a month. And actually the infrastructure for this came from a Hector Zamora project 2 editions ago, where we learned how to work with these artisans. We found the community. And then over the course of the 9 days, there was a performative element where women would wash down the unfired pots and they would melt. And then there were musicians playing the fired ones to conjure this sense of thunder. I love this project, and I wanted to do this project in Desert X. But a project that in Bangladesh costs $30,000 and changes the lives of these potters would cost $350,000 to do, just because of, like, the cost of labor, the clay, the materials. So it's really it's interesting to see context and what you can do and what you cannot do. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
It's both of you seem to be like there's a clarity, especially in your bio. You said you want to bring, like, different marginalized or, like, indigenous voices to the fore, and you've been working on social practice and politics for a long time. How do these platforms enable you to activate your personal missions, and visions?
If I can remember it, I'm going to get the requisite sort of Orwell citation out of the way, and I'm going to maul it. He said in, I don't remember which essay now. See, I'm already mauling it. That what he wanted to do was to make political writing into an art, right? I think it's a personal mission. I sort of figured out some time ago that writing about art, I wanted to make writing about art and making shows political. That is, I sort of wanted to expand the access and make it more public, to allow to be an interlocutor for artists whose messages and whose artworks should be better known because they aim for larger publics. And that's, I think, sort of a fundamental thing. And also sort of recognize maybe works that should have greater visibility and function as an interlocutor for them to gain greater visibility. That's basically sort of, if I can boil it down to a mission statement, that's more or less it.
So yeah, one of the reviews that I really loved, or like, from the public in the of Desert X was like, wow, this show has people that look like me. And I think in land art, it's mostly like white men making that kind of art. So, and this is not like this is not an identity politics sort of thing, but when I got this opportunity, I thought it was great. Like, women can make work like this. It's just that maybe they didn't have access to those resources, right? So how do I make those resources available to them? So it was a challenge for the team, because sometimes when you haven't worked like this before, what's all the engineering that needs to be done to make work outside that can outlast like crazy winds? There's California building code. It's like some serious infrastructure. But at the end of the day, I was so happy. My goal was actually, instead of like a mirror house, could it be like a female artist of color that would be the image of the show? And actually it's split, but one of them is a work by Rana Begum, which maybe you've seen these, it almost looks like a mountain out of yellow chain link fence. And Rana is also, so she is British Bangladeshi. She left Bangladesh when she was about 7. And her work. She's very moved by, I guess, poetic geometry in everyday materials she sees around the world. So in Bangladesh, it could be fishing nets. Here it was chain link fences that were ubiquitous in Southern California. But suddenly she made these chain link fences, which have a very constraining and very frightening feel like they were floating, feel like it was a sense of freedom. And I'll keep who it was confidential, but a friend told me she was on a jury for an arts council thing, and someone said Rana's work is not political. It's too beautiful. There's nothing political. But this friend argued the fact that Rana is even an artist is political. She had to escape an arranged marriage that she didn't want to be in. Her family cut her off, and like as a single woman, a single mother of two, to fight to be an artist and now have this kind of career is extremely moving, I think.
I
And
don't think beautiful and political are in
I
any
agree.
way
I
sort of
agree.
at odds.
Yeah.
And I've seen that piece reproduced. It's perfectly political, literally from just looking at it.
Exactly.
In terms of reproduction. Yeah, and I should mention some of the artists, for crying out loud, who were on the show. Narcisa Martinez, for example, who Charlie James is down here. I don't know what is in his booth because I haven't been able to go by. But Narcisa Martinez is a guy who, besides having been picked for, what was it, the Freeze Icon bit in LA about a month ago, is a guy who came over from Mexico at 20. He crossed the border a number of times, one took, and then worked his way through, first to learn English, then, grade school, then high school, then art school, and eventually graduate school. And at some point he got, he had a eureka moment and he started painting portraits of, I should have also added that essentially he did all this working in the fields, as a field worker, one of the images that's sort of cycling around, you'll see that there are portraits of other field workers that he is now doing atop produce and fruit boxes. So there's a beautiful sort of form meets content sort of thing that's happening there. Anyway, he's just an amazing artist. And those are the kinds of stories that you really sort of want to amplify, to get back to the point I was sort of initially trying to make. Yeah.
Beautiful. There was also an image where you maybe saw some black and white drawings on paper with some kind of mini toy soldiers and like some large figures. So that's a work by an indigenous artist from Bangladesh named Joy Debrawaja. He's from the Tripura community. And something that's interesting with the more time I spent in Bangladesh, the word Bangladesh is also a bit problematic. It means the land of people who speak Bangla, but there's over 40 other indigenous languages. And the Chittagong Hill Tracts are super militarized. So the work of this artist is basically he rescales his community of indigenous people to make the military seem tiny. And like in his practice, he's really this kind of leader for his community. And so when we met him, he doesn't even speak Bangla well, definitely doesn't speak English. And we loved the work, and we've been working with him since I think every summit. He now has a gallery. That project was a move from the Dhaka Art Summit to a solo booth in Art Basel, Hong Kong, and was acquired by a major museum. I can't say which one it is yet. But the thing is, that for me is incredible. Also just the voice for his people. And even in Bangladesh, people are like, you were in a government building. How did you get away with showing that work? Because it's actually extremely critical of the Bangladesh government. But in a way, in art, you can do that. Like, so the American ambassador was saying that in the book fair, there was a book about indigenous issues that was censored. How did I do this? And I'm like, it's art, it's imagination, it's fine.
And one of the, I'm so sorry, but one of the things about sort of like conceptualism from the global South is that it's an alternative version, a much more political version of conceptualism than we get up in these sort of latitudes,
And I think for us with infrastructure, so I mentioned that we've decided not to make these kinds of climate conditions, but we're only 9 days. But we do think it's important to conserve artworks. But what's wonderful is a lot of museums have acquired, and we're not financially involved in those acquisitions at all, but there's just great work being produced for this platform. So they find homes in other museums, but we also have built storage facilities so that we could keep work in the region so that it's not all going out. But yeah, I think it's this infrastructure is also like, how do you use other people's infrastructure and work as a team?
And I think this, for me, it's the final question, and then we can pass it to the floor. But we didn't really speak about audiences. I know that Dhaka Art Summit gets 600,000 visitors in the last one over 9 days, which is incredible. So how do you think about the activation of audiences and their role within the success of the project?
I mean, they're very much part of it, but actually we have to change how we work because certain artworks are not safe with audience numbers like that. Or also you can't, how do you see like a small Lucas Arruda painting with a crowd like that, but works that really worked. So for example, it took me 8 years to convince him to do this, but Roman Ondak, we showed Measuring the Universe, and he didn't want to lend that work out because it's just been done so many times. But this is a work where everyone who comes in gets their height measured and their name and the date written on the wall. But because of our audience, it's never looked like that before for him, and he was just like mind blown. What was beautiful was that this piece was made as he watched his son grow up, right, and was writing his height on the wall. And his son was my assistant for a long time. So father and son came. Father is now like this, son is like that. But the audience loved it and were part of the creation of the work. And the audience, it also grows exponentially because people tell their friends. So it's not an even thing. But yeah, I think it's also, for a while, we even thought about stopping the summit because we are opening a permanent building next year. And again, to spend, like, our budget's around 2.5 million, which in Bangladesh is a lot of money. Like, should we be putting that into something permanent? But the joy that this gives, it's like we can't take that away from people, so.
Well, 600,000 is amazing. That's
rounded up. But
yeah, well, I hope so. It's a good problem to have, but I can imagine how it's also a real problem. So, you talked about sort of iterative development, and we're still at the beginning of that stage. I think. Converge again has put out really amazing sort of iterations previous to my getting anywhere near the project, but I think it's correct to say that this is the most ambitious we've gotten yet, and I have the board and certainly my founding director, who's sitting somewhere over there, to thank for that. I don't know where we are going to necessarily be with numbers, but I do know that we're literally looking to drive the bus as safely and as quickly as possible, and to get very solid numbers over 100,000 would be ideal. Yes,
I mean, it was, it didn't have to, I kind of threw that number out there. It doesn't have to be a question about numbers, but whether you conceive of their participation or how you think about audience experience.
But for me, when I think of success, it's really impact. And so, and that's something, like there's an example of a group that we work with called the Gidri Bali Foundation for the Arts, and they have this puppet theater group made of children in their village. And in their village, it's mostly climate migrants. So they come from all over the country, but it's a place where suddenly you have Hindu communities, Muslim communities, indigenous communities all mixed, but they're working together. And these kids performed in the Dhaka Art Summit. They were in the newspaper. Suddenly, like, APT in Australia commissioned them to make a video. The kids all got artist fees, and now, like, for the first time in that community, the girls are entering high school because their parents see the role of culture and see that kind of value. And that, to me, even if no one came to visit the summit, is an amazing impact. And to watch those kids grow up is incredible. So great. And thank you to Expo Chicago and to Bene and to everyone who made this talk possible, and all of you for joining us here.
Pleasure. Thank you.